Evolving God, the Theology in Bergson, continuing on Bergson and the Holographic Theory series. So scenes like this strike the soul. The poor zebras being destroyed, cruelly attacked, eaten by the crocodiles, or the wildebeest. To quote Bergson, the discord, striking and terrible, for which the original principle of life must not be held responsible. Or scenes of the dead from the Ukraine war. This one actually being a somewhat antiseptic one. Why? Our theology has struggled. The explanations are problematic, unsatisfying, but theology is hardly a student of time. Its roots lie in the Platonic vision, a static, unchanging God, a God containing the causes within himself of the entire universe. Let's think again about the Platonic conception of immutable ideas. In that conception, one yet had to account, we saw, for becoming and change. To quote Bergson, rather than lay the blame on the attitude of thought and language toward the course of things, a very intellect, a process of thinking, they preferred to pronounce the course of things itself to be wrong. Spatial movement, all change, all becoming, was relegated to being an illusion. At the base of their thought, there is more to the motionless than in the moving. In other words, the static reigns. The ideas or forms are the whole of intelligible reality, said Bergson. They represent altogether, for the Greeks, the theoretical equilibrium of being. Being becomes one vast idea, a single moment, eternity, symbolized by my little cloud there. So motion, change, growth, the growth from infant to adolescent to adult, is seen as a diminution of being, a less than being, unworthy of being. We and our science have never truly broken from this. I noted this in number 60 in Stella Maris and other places. Plato and the Greek science of reality. We move to a new science of reality under Galileo and Descartes, a precise description mathematically of motion, instant by instant. And philosophy attempted to leave the Greeks and embrace this new science with Spinoza, Descartes himself, Leibniz, and ultimately Kant, our current state, essentially. But never were they truly able to break from the Greek conception, the static conception. So Bergson was almost entirely silent on theology. Yet there are profound theological implications in his work. This has always been obvious. Of course, theology, like philosophy, has ignored Bergson. So there's not much from the theologians. I found one article which contains the statement, a philosophy which does not depend on argument can't, of course, be refuted by argument. This was on radicalfaith.org, a site now for sale, under a discussion of Bergson and his relation to philosophy. So if that's your view of Bergson, we're not going to get very far. That is, that he had no argument. This is really the one worthy treatment I found. It's by Frank Hugh Foster. As you can see, some theistic implications of Bergson's philosophy in the American Journal of Theology, written in 1918. It was a journal that existed from 1897 to 1920. Foster himself notes that none of the great theological reviews, he lists 6 of them, had yet addressed Bergson as of 1918. He notes the Catholic World, that is the 7th one, yes, but only from immovable adherence to Aquinas, which is to say, Aristotle. In other words, not listening to Bergson at all. This was 1918. At least by 1940, already Bergson was buried. To Foster, this was a sad state of affairs. He says, for the objections to the static view of God are exceedingly weighty and altogether unrefuted by our historic theologies. We shall see, I think, that every attempt to carry out the unchangeability of God to its legitimate consequences has provoked revolt. So let's begin with this static view. Foster starts with supralapsarian Calvinism, a religious stance he notes that ultimately is refuted by their own adherents a bit, but we'll see why. Not the most followed, shall we say. He says, God is viewed by this theory as existing by himself in eternity before the world was created. Now, this is a good example of the static view. The object of the creation is his own glory, that is, the expression of his own nature. Among his perfections are two, mutually exclusive but complementary, and together exhausting his nature in one aspect, mercy and justice. Since he is unchangeable, both of these attributes must be displayed. Hence, of the beings to be created, some must be made happy in heaven, and so glorify his mercy, and some must be punished in hell, and so glorify his justice. There's a few decrees implied that Foster notes. The first decree, separating mankind into the saved and the lost for all eternity. The second decree of God, the creation, and to prepare for salvation and punishment, introduce sin. And then the third decree is the fall of Adam and Eve. He says, thus God's unchangeability is maintained, but entirely indifferent to human needs, contemplating and disposing of human beings as if they were mere arithmetical units, an unchangeability of ice. So Foster noted back in 1918, Calvinists repudiate this form of Calvinism, though Foster noted, though illogically. But the core of the problem is endemic. To quote, the incarnation, for example, of Christ is defined by Chalcedon as the union in one person of two natures, divine and human, each still subsisting perfect and entire. That formula, directly inspired by the conception of divine unchangeability, is absolutely meaningless. In fact, most of its defenders take refuge in mystery and incomprehensibility, or escape route. He notes, God is unchangeably wise, all-powerful and everywhere present. Man is ignorant, weak, and localized. But by this doctrine, the same person, Christ, is both all-wise and ignorant, almighty and weak, omnipresent and localized, stuck at the same spot, all at the same time. What more utter abnegation of reason is conceivable? Now, before any Christian folks here get upset, there is no attempt on my part here to demean Christ. Note, I've also done this one on the shroud, a subject that I think absolutely verifies his resurrection. So, a more fundamental difficulty, the principle of causality as applied to the nature of God. To quote, the principle of physical causation involves the sufficiency of every cause to accomplish the effect ascribed to it. The power manifested in the effect must have been previously in the cause, and in this sense, there can be nothing new. And he notes the brightness of the acetylene flame arises from the richness of the gas in the carbon, the multitudinous particles of which, as they burn, give this extraordinary light. There can be no carbon burnt, which is not in the unburnt gas. And there's a huge amount of such examples one could give. Hence, he says, if by naming God the cause of the universe, we mean that he is this in a physical sense, he must always have had in himself all that ever appears in the universe to the end of time. Very well, but what then is the object of the universe? Why should it be created? The theologians answer, to exhibit God's perfections. But does this exhibition do anything? Or is it a vain and ineffective show? If it merely represents or repeats that which is eternally the same, it lacks sufficient reason. The divine being who seeks a mere display of his perfections is open to the charge of what men call in human affairs poor and contemptible vanity. And he notes, when the display of creation is ended and all things have returned into themselves, what is the meaning of the whole? Or if there be a body of eternal created spirits like angels to enjoy the eternal demonstration, what do they know of God that he did not know of himself before the eternities? Then he says, how is this spiritual religion as taught by Christ even possible? Knowledge of God, companionship of the soul with him. He says, how can there be companionship if there is no sympathy? And how sympathy if there is no fellowship in suffering? And how suffering in the ever-blessed and unchanging God? Even the Pauline pupil who wrote the epistle to the Hebrews understood this necessity, for he made the suffering of the divine Jesus essential to his perfection. But the suffering, to mean anything to us, must be suffering of the divine nature through humanity, and thus we are carried back to the unsolved and insoluble difficulties of the incarnation. There is no relief here from the embarrassments of the idea of a static God. Now on this subject of sympathy, back to the theme I've noted a few times, instinct, a form of intuition. How, asks Bergson, does the wasp know the 9 precise points to sting on the caterpillar plus a head twist to sting it, to paralyze it, so it serves as a nice live food for its young? Neo-Darwinism, as we're in the evolutionary context, cannot explain this. Not step-by-step evolution, or the wasp never gets going as a species. But note how deep this concept of sympathy goes into the heart of evolution and the material world, a universal sympathy in Bergson's vision. For he notes, the wasp knows the necessary points by sympathy. Wasp and caterpillar are 2 activities, not 2 truly separate objects in the universal field, as we'll see when we look again a bit at Bergson's vision of motion, and the motion of the universal field. It's a whole sympathetic unto itself. In a footnote, Foster notes William James in his Varieties of Religious Experience. For James, what is deduction of the metaphysical attributes of God but a shuffling and matching of pedantic dictionary adjectives aloof from morals, aloof from human needs, something that might be worked out from the mere word God by one of those logical machines, like the word vector space of ChatGPT. From the point of view of practical religion, the metaphysical monster which they offer to worship is an absolutely worthless invention of the scholarly mind. We are thus possibly prepared, says Foster, for the suggestion derived from Bergson that God is himself by his very nature, not a static, but a progressing being, one himself passing through an evolution, or essentially a becoming. Bergson first accepts the hypotheses of evolution. At its basis, there is a unified force, producing and impelling it along its path of progress. This force, because life is its chief display, Bergson calls the vital impulse. He accepts the view of modern science that matter is itself not so much a product of force as force itself. It is composed of motions, whirling movements, vortices, which are continuous, as we'll note, indivisible, and constitute its being. It is not a thing, or not a thing, which is made by these motions. So let's talk on this notion of force in the concept of the philosophy of physics of Bergson, as opposed to Foster the theologian's recounting of it. Force is a function of acceleration, F equal ma. Therefore, believe it or not, force cannot be considered an absolute, not in the framework of physics. Velocity, the rate of change of position. Acceleration, the rate of change of position. So force is bound with this relative movement. It's one with change of position, relative. In the classic framework, relativity is inescapable. Move the object across the continuum with the coordinate system as such, or the continuum across the object or underneath the object as such. Now, this is not real motion. The motion, quote unquote, of the cup in this framework becomes rest. Unchanging perspective, simply unchanging of perspective, it becomes rest. But you cannot treat mountain ranges rising, people aging, becoming couch potatoes, etc., as nothing but as not real motion, as fictitious motion. But once this continuum, well, it's the abstract space of a classic metaphysic of space and time. It's imposed over the concrete extensity of the concrete world pictured there. A framework, a mesh, so to speak, placed over concrete extensity. It's the 3D continuum of points, positions. It's infinitely divisible space. Motion, we move the cup through the continuum, is seen or becomes an infinite regress. It's always a series of static points. It is static immobilities. Between each pair of those points, we can have another line with another infinite density of points in between, and we continue this ad infinitum. But note, we're constructing motion, so to speak, by static immobilities. That is, we are explaining yet motion via the static elements or static ideas of the Greeks. Time simply becomes the fourth dimension in this abstract space, the series of instants corresponding, as it were, to each point on a motion. So you get a vast 4D space, a 4D continuum. But this is the metaphysic undergirding mathematics and physics. In Bergson's temporal metaphysic, motion is indivisible. You can't treat it as a series of points or static immobilities. It's like a melody, each note, instant, permeating, interpenetrating the next, the state of each as a note reflective of the entire preceding series. It's an organic continuity, not a mathematical density of points. In itself, it becomes a primary memory. The transformation of the universe now has this attribute, a primary memory, where each instant is not falling into the non-existence of the past, as implied in the classic metaphysic of instants. So force, as physics defines it, F equal ma, is simply an invariance law. It cannot be a cause. It cannot be an absolute. Says Bergson, it is in vain then that we seek to found the reality of motion on a cause which is distinct from it. Analysis always brings us back to motion itself. The motions of objects, quote unquote objects, like our caterpillar and the wasp, quote objects, are changes or transfers of state within the global motion of the whole. That is the real motion of the whole, indivisible, melodic, ultimately creative. And this force must be understood as identical with the vital impulse, says Foster. Viewing the universe thus, the fact which first and most constantly attracts the attention is the constant change through which everything is passing. All things are in flux, and this is not a change without meaning. So before going to the cosmic level of change, becoming, evolution, transformation, take the personal, simply our voluntary action, reaching the cup out to get it filled with coffee. If physics had stayed cautionary, as Newton did, F equal ma, an invariance law, force being an invariance law, but it did not. Einstein, in his principle of equivalence acceleration to an absolute force, which is a mistaken analysis, though at the heart of general relativity. But had it stayed so, then with the same caution, psychology would say that our inner causality has no relation to the mechanical effect of one object upon another. The cue ball 8-ball model would be an incorrect model of action, of our own personal action. The cue ball 8-ball model That latter, this, can be conceived as capable of repeating in a homogeneous, abstract space of the classic metaphysic, and thus expressible by law. Cue ball repeats hitting 8 ball. But this level is only a practical level. In a dynamically becoming universe, each instant reflection of the preceding series, nothing is truly repeatable. The cue ball is not the same. The cue is not the same. Nothing is the same. Only practically can it be looked at as the same. So consciousness flows in real time. Its states, quote unquote, can never recur. They are not truly repeatable. Each state is being a reflection of the preceding series. So all our action in this sense is creative. It has a cyclical component. That component is part of our participation with the dynamic, creative becoming of the universe itself. Let's add from Bergson, God thus defined as nothing of the already made. He is unceasing life, action, freedom. Creation so conceived is not a mystery. We experience it in ourselves when we act freely, even reaching out for the coffee. But going to the level of cosmic being, this non-repeatability is true for the motion of the entire matter field, the field in which our individual consciousness integrally participates, as noted. Again, only at a sufficient scale can we see things as practically repeatable, subject to classical laws. But this pure mathematical, mechanical, infinitely repeatable treatment is artificial. It's timeless. That classic metaphysic, the abstract space, is an ideal limit, never truly reached by the universe. Notes Bergson, we must wait for the sugar cube in the glass of water to dissolve. Time is a force, and the duration of the universe, the paced unfolding, must therefore be one with the latitude of creation which can find place in it. So the time taken for the sugar cube to dissolve is an expression of the creation, the degree of creation in the universe, even at this micro scale. We can't speed it up. We can't take the classic metaphysics, the abstract space, apply our mathematical law within that framework, speed it up or slow it down at will. Can't happen. That is not an expression of the concrete reality of the universe. So the paced unfolding seen at its evolutionary scale, to quote Foster, that is, we're now creating brontosaurs, butterflies, and beetles. It undoubtedly manifests now as improvement, now as deterioration. But as a whole, the change is evidently a progress. If the vital impulse be called a thrust, it is a thrust upward, that is, to ever higher forms of consciousness, ever greater development. Now Foster says, Bergson had not identified the vital impulse with God. Well, we just saw one spot in the last slide. But let's say that identification was very underemphasized. Foster noted a couple statements. A letter of Bergson's, this is a book by Miller in 1916, in Bergson and Religion. To quote, the considerations set forth in My Time and Free Will, quoting Bergson, are intended to bring to light the fact of liberty. Those in matter and memory touch with the reality of the spirit. Those in creative evolution present creation as a fact. From all this, we derive a clear idea of a free and creating God, producing matter and life at once, whose creative effort is continued in a vital direction by the evolution of species and the construction of human personalities. And from an interview with Louis Levine, quoting Levine, the source of life, God, is undoubtedly spiritual. Is it personal? Do we have a personal God? Probably. There are not sufficient data to answer this question, but Professor Bergson is inclined to think that it is personal. It seems to him that personality is the very intention of the evolution of life, and that human personality is just one mode in which this intention is realized. It is therefore very probable that the spiritual source of life whence our personality springs, should be personal itself. Personal in the larger sense of the term, a spiritual unity expressing itself in the creative process of evolution. So this would be a point where we would or could discuss Bergson's rather implicit theory of the soul, entirely implicit, and the profound entwining of his theory of memory, personality, and soul, where memory, that is experience, cannot be stored in the brain, for we are 4D beings, four-dimensional beings, time extended. As in the little picture I like to show here, all our experiences of coffee stirring, not stored in the brain, but are the four-dimensional extension of being to the very fact that we are moving in time indivisibly. There's no instance that can be cut off and fall into the past. And in Bergson's theory of perception, we had to note that the event, that coffee stirring that our man is looking at, is right where it says it is, external within the field on the kitchen table. Therefore, experience is not occurring solely within the brain in the first place. Therefore, it cannot be solely stored there. And then we're kind of integrating, representing their integration, the remembrance of one of those past experiences, or the concept of stop coffee stirring, essentially that invariant structure of the event driving a reconstructive wave through our 4D being, reconstructing those experiences. But note, it's just not coffee stirrings that are in our 4D being. There's all our experiences, going to school, studying, working in our cubicles, taking canoe trips, all the decisions we've made. That's our personality, our character, through our 4D being. So we're looking at the essence of soul here. A dear friend of mine, a gal at Oxford, has recently sent me her just completed PhD thesis on this subject, and it's entitled On the Memory of the Soul, the Spiritualist Metaphysic of St. Augustine and Henry Bergson. There's a tremendous correlation between the two, St. Augustine and Bergson. Not that Bergson was very conversant with St. Augustine, but it's there. So she's likely a bit away from a book on this. I'm likely to leave the subject to her, but there's a profound exegesis there of the implications for the nature of soul in Bergson's theory of memory. One can see then how theology is in fact inescapably tied to the problems of consciousness, the hard problem. How do we see the coffee cup, perception, memory, and the problems of physics? Now, I doubt the theologians want to hear this. So concluding, my original intent was more of a contemplation of this problem, evil, suffering, pain in this world, and I kind of achieved here. I think it's bigger than I want to think about. Bergson saw this ever-evolving, becoming God as experimenting, moving to forms, beings capable of ever more freedom of action, ever higher consciousness. He argued the universe was not created at all at once. It's still being created. Time is not only a force, he argued, time is invention. At every instant, a hesitation before possibilities. Time is this hesitation, or it's nothing. Back to why we have to wait for the sugar to dissolve. The amount of freedom involved in that evolution. We are integrally a part of this flow, this universal field. This seems an inevitable byproduct. The poor zebra and the crocodile. Somehow, by some form of enlightenment, union with the cosmic mind, we have to come to a greater comprehension of this. But this is a start. So Postscript 1. For me to delineate what's occurred in theology as far as Bergson goes since 1918 would be quite a task. So I think it's not all that much, not that much has occurred. Google searching, I noticed this, and of course it all depends on how one Google searches. This 2024 book, Henry Bergson and the Philosophy of Religion, God, Freedom, and Duration. And I found a review article, and the reviewer was noting the statement from the book. Temporal objects are a compound of the temporal glue provided by la durée, duration, which is dependent on individual human observers and timeless being, which comes from God. You know, this reads like a fusion of Aquinas and Kant. And the statement kind of looks like nothing from Bergson that I would exactly understand to be so. I doubt there's much of an explication of Bergson's theory of perception in this book, just from looking at that statement. And if it looks like a fusion of Aquinas and a Kant, then two folks Bergson was concerned to show the errors thereof, at least the Aristotelian aspect of Aquinas, we have a problem. An actual understanding of Bergson, a true deep understanding of his theory of perception and memory is going to be, well, as far from the current state of affairs, and it's going to be critical. So, second postscript. Between 1918 and 2024, there was Teilhard de Chardin. Lived from 1881 to 1955, a French Jesuit, Catholic priest, scientist, paleontologist, theologian, philosopher, and teacher. Interesting from the point of view of our crocodiles and zebras, the suffering in this world. Mobilized in December 1914, Teilhard served in World War I as a stretcher bearer in the 8th Moroccan Rifles. For his valor, he received several citations, including the Military Medal and the Legion of Honor. He later wrote, below the picture there, the war was a meeting with the absolute. So obviously, it would have had quite an effect. Now, before the war, for the next 4 years, 1909 to 1912, he was a scholastic at Orr Place in Hastings, East Sussex, where he acquired his theological formation. There he synthesized his scientific, philosophical, and theological knowledge in the light of evolution. At that time, he read Creative Evolution by Henry Bergson, about which he wrote that, quote, "The only effect that brilliant book had upon me was to provide fuel at just the right moment, and very briefly, for a fire that was already consuming my heart and mind." So the book, The Phenomenon of Man, published posthumously, set forth a sweeping account of the unfolding of the cosmos and the evolution of matter to humanity. The unfolding of the material cosmos is described from primordial particles to the development of life, human beings, and the noosphere, and finally to his vision of the omega point, symbolized on the book cover there, the omega point in the biological context. So finally to this vision of the omega point in the future, which is pulling all creation towards it. But Bergson requires far more study than this statement indicates. Very briefly. And Bergson would have rejected the omega point, the pulling to an end goal, as rank finalism, which is only the other side of the coin of mechanistic determinism. Same thing. Cosmic being is truly creative, truly free. There is no end to evolution. We wonder if God himself, in other words, knows exactly where he's going. He's evolving. So theology, when you do better than Chardin. So next we'll see. Again, I'd say take a look at this book, Challenge to AI and Time, Consciousness, Bergson, Gibson, Problems of Artificial Intelligence and AGI, and a lot of this stuff we've covered. Till then, signing off.